Henry VIII's reign is often remembered for his many marriages, but what if I told you that his quest for a male heir wasn't the only reason behind his 6 marriages? You might think Henry was simply driven by love or lust, but there's a darker, more complex story here. One full of power struggles, political maneuvers, and a desperate need to control the future of his dynasty. It all started with his first wife, Katherine of Aragon. Henry was desperate to have a male heir, but Katherine, though beloved by the people, couldn't provide him with one. You'd think a king like Henry would be patient, but instead the pressure mounted. What did this marriage tell us about Henry's ambitions and desires? Could this failure to produce a male heir have been the real driving force behind his decisions? We've all heard about his split from the Catholic Church, but did you know it was all part of his effort to have a son? Henry's desperation pushed him to take drastic actions, but was it really about wanting a child, or something deeper? Something that involved a series of intricate political plays, power shifts, and yes, even betrayal. The fallout from Katherine of Aragon's inability to provide an heir rippled through the entire royal court, shaking the foundation of English rule. But let's go back to Henry's first wife, Katherine. Did she really fail Henry, or was the problem much bigger than just producing a son? It's not as straightforward as it seems. Katherine's marriage to Henry was rooted in dynastic politics, not just love. She had been married to his brother before Henry, and yet Henry married her despite this, likely for the sake of securing an alliance with Spain. But their marriage wasn't about passion. Katherine had been waiting years for the king's affection to turn into a real bond. But what happens when a king loses faith in a queen's ability to give him an heir? It was at this point that Henry's frustration with Katherine became apparent. The pressure of having to produce a male heir was more than just a royal responsibility for Henry, it was personal. Katherine, despite being a devoted wife, had failed him in the one thing that mattered most, securing the Tudor dynasty. But was that truly her fault? As Henry's frustrations mounted, the court began to buzz with rumors of a divorce. The problem, however, wasn't just Katherine. Henry's desperation was tied to something larger. The fate of the nation rested on his ability to produce an heir. The Tudor line needed to continue, and without a son, all of Henry's political maneuvering would be in vain. This marriage, however, set the stage for everything that followed. Henry wasn't the only one with an agenda. Katherine, too, had a lot to lose. She wasn't just an obedient queen. She was a woman of strong will and intellect. Her refusal to accept a divorce wasn't just stubbornness. It was about preserving her dignity, her reputation, and her place in history. Katherine had been raised to be a queen, and she wasn't about to let a political misstep destroy her life. What did this refusal say about the role of women at court? Could Katherine have done things differently? Could she have saved her marriage? The real twist came when Henry, unable to convince Katherine to step aside, took matters into his own hands. The break from Rome was a dramatic, dangerous move. Henry VIII defied the Pope, created his own Church of England, and positioned himself as both the political and religious leader of his kingdom. But what was this really about? Was it about religion, or was it more about Henry's own desire to control his future and the future of his dynasty? The world was shaken when Henry separated from the Catholic Church. This wasn't just a theological dispute. It was a clear sign that Henry was willing to go to extreme lengths to get what he wanted. The ripple effect of this decision was felt throughout Europe and changed the political landscape forever. But was this decision purely a personal one, or was Henry's break from Rome simply the most calculated political move he could have made to secure his own future and that of his bloodline? Now let's think about the timing here. This was a king who had already proven himself capable of ruling a kingdom with an iron fist, but was his need for control in his personal life simply a reflection of his rule in the public sphere? Was Henry's emotional need for a male heir so intertwined with his royal ambition that he was willing to reshape the entire English political system just to get what he wanted? As his break from Rome solidified, Henry's search for a male heir took on even greater significance. It was no longer just about an heir, it was about power, and Henry wasn't willing to let anything stand in his way. The choices he made following his divorce from Katherine marked the beginning of an era that would change England forever. But was Henry the villain in this story, or was he simply a man trapped by his circumstances? Was his pursuit of a male heir really about family and legacy, or was it about something far more complex, his own power, his own sense of control? As we continue, we'll dive deeper into his other marriages, each one adding more complexity to his quest for an heir. Was each marriage a strategic move, or a desperate attempt to restore balance to his fractured kingdom? Henry's journey to find a wife who could give him a male heir is often depicted as a search for love, but as we've seen, it was much more about survival, politics, and the thirst for control. Henry VIII's marriages weren't simply about love, they were about legacy and the lengths to which a king would go to secure his dynasty. The question remains, was this all about a son, or was something far deeper at play? And we'll discover more as we continue to unravel the complexities of Henry's tumultuous relationships. So why did Henry marry 6 women? Was it really about an heir, or was there more at play? Power, betrayal, and the hidden forces shaping a kingdom's future? The answer is much more complicated than you might think. Katherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII, was a woman of immense strength and character. A member of the powerful Spanish royal family, she was no stranger to the intricacies of courtly life. But behind the royal title and respect, Katherine was a queen in crisis. She was married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, who died suddenly. Then, she became the wife of Henry, who initially adored her. But things quickly turned sour power, and the very foundation of their marriage began to crack when Catherine failed to provide the son Henry desperately needed. You see, Henry's reign was defined by one obsession: the survival of his bloodline. The idea of a son wasn't just about personal legacy, it was about the security of his kingdom, his throne, and the Tudor dynasty itself. Henry needed a male heir to secure his future, and Catherine couldn't provide him with one. But here's the twist: this wasn't just about her inability to bear a son. Catherine had already given birth to a healthy daughter, Mary, but Henry was fixated on having a male heir, which became his obsession, leading to an unraveling of a seemingly perfect marriage. For Catherine, the pressure of failing to give Henry a son was unbearable, but she had more to lose than just her position as queen. She had lost her first husband and now faced the looming threat of divorce. What would that mean for her status, her dignity, and her identity? At the time, marriage to the king wasn't just a personal bond, it was a political contract. To lose that contract was not just humiliating, it was devastating. And what's even more remarkable is how Catherine refused to accept the divorce. Her refusal wasn't out of spite or stubbornness, but out of a deep sense of loyalty. Catherine stood firm in her belief that her marriage to Henry was valid, even though the king believed otherwise. She held on to the dignity of their union, fighting with everything she had to maintain her position as queen. It's a fascinating display of strength and pride, especially considering the court pressures that must have weighed on her. The real question is, why didn't Henry simply accept that he and Catherine couldn't have a male heir together? Was there a deeper issue at play? Catherine wasn't just a wife, she was a symbol of Spanish political power, a pawn in a larger game of diplomacy. But the drama behind the marriage was about more than just royally alliances. The pressures to produce a male heir, as well as the power struggles between England and Spain, made this marriage much more complicated than it seemed. And then, there's the king's character. Henry was a man of enormous power, but his decisions were often impulsive and fueled by a desire for control. Was this the same man who once admired Catherine for her intelligence and loyalty? The early stages of their marriage were filled with affection, yet the moment Catherine failed to give him a son, Henry's admiration turned to frustration. Henry's desire for control became more and more apparent, and Catherine's inability to fulfill his wishes set off a chain of events that would change the course of English history forever. Here's the controversial part. Catherine's own powerlessness in the situation is shocking. She had the strength of a queen, yet the weight of her royal duties wasn't enough to keep her marriage intact. It's easy to think of her as just the victim, but in reality, her refusal to accept the divorce represented a powerful challenge to Henry's authority. Catherine, in her own way, fought to preserve her dignity, and in doing so, she gave us a glimpse of the hidden strength that royal women often had to conceal behind their public images. Her role as a political player is often overlooked, but her resistance to the divorce was an act of defiance against the system. At this point, the tension had already reached a boiling point. Henry's desire to marry Anne Boleyn, his second wife, would be the catalyst that sparked a revolution in both English politics and religion. Catherine's refusal to step aside meant that Henry had no choice but to act. What he did next is perhaps one of the most controversial decisions in royal history. He broke away from the Roman Catholic Church. This move wasn't just about a divorce. It was a calculated, dramatic response to his inability to secure the male heir he needed. It would not only destroy his marriage to Catherine, but it would forever alter the relationship between England and the Church. This separation from Rome didn't happen overnight. Henry's decision was deeply intertwined with the pressures of having a son in the political environment of the time. Was it truly about religion, or was this about Henry asserting his dominance and control over every aspect of his life? The impact of his decision rippled through the entire country, and Catherine's resistance would set the stage for England's dramatic break from Catholicism. But Catherine wasn't finished yet. She had one final act of defiance, refusing to accept the title of Princess Dowager that Henry wanted to assign her after the divorce. She would not be stripped of her dignity. She would remain queen in name, even if not in title, and her steadfast refusal to yield would cement her legacy as a woman of unmatched strength in a world dominated by men. Catherine's story is one of resilience, and in some ways her refusal to accept the divorce gives us insight into the tragic dynamic between her and Henry. This marriage revealed a great deal about Henry's character, and not in a favorable light. On one hand, he was a man who prized loyalty and intelligence in his wife, traits that Catherine embodied. But on the other hand, his desperation for a son led him to act rashly and impulsively, disregarding the very qualities he once admired in her. Could he have ruled differently? Could the Tudor dynasty have been just as strong if Henry had been patient, or at least more accepting of his fate with Catherine? In this section, we've only scratched the surface of the complex relationship between Henry VIII and Katherine of Aragon. What we know for sure is that it wasn't just about producing a male heir. It was about control, power, and the lengths that Henry was willing to go to in order to secure his future. But was it the pressure of the crown that drove him, or was there something else, something more personal at play? Stay with us as we move forward and begin to explore the dynamic between Henry and his next wife, Anne Boleyn. You might think you know her story, but as we'll see, there's so much more to her than meets the eye. Jane Seymour's story is one of tragedy, loyalty, and what many would call fate. Henry VIII's third wife, Jane, gave him what he had been longing for, his longed-for male heir. But behind that triumph was a much more sorrowful truth. She died shortly after childbirth, leaving Henry devastated. But was Jane Seymour Seymour just the solution to Henry's succession problem? Or was she truly the one Henry loved the most? Or was she just an instrumental figure in securing the future of his dynasty? Let's go back to the beginning. Jane Seymour, unlike the previous wives, didn't come from a powerful European royal family or have ambitious political connections. She was, in many ways, the perfect contrast to Henry's first two wives. While Katherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn had been politically driven, Jane was more of a quiet, gentle figure. She had none of the flamboyance or the dangerous ambition that Anne had brought to the throne. Jane's modesty was her greatest asset, and it's often said that Henry found peace in her presence. The truth, however, is more complicated. Jane was not the one who sought Henry's affections. Rather, she was sought after. She didn't have the manipulative ambition that Anne had, but Jane played the role of dutiful lady-in-waiting, and in time became Henry's third wife. Was it about Jane that made Henry fall in love with her, especially when he had already been through such tumultuous marriages? Perhaps it was Jane's calm demeanor, or her seeming compliance with Henry's wishes that attracted him. But there was also something deeper at play. Jane wasn't just another wife to Henry. She was a woman who represented the possibility of a new beginning, a new heir, and when Jane became pregnant, the nation held its breath. Imagine the immense pressure Jane was under. Henry's previous wives had failed to give him a son, and his desperation for a male heir grew with each passing year. Katherine of Aragon had failed him, Anne Boleyn had failed him, and now it was Jane's turn to carry the fate of the Tudor dynasty, and Jane delivered. In October 1537, she gave birth to Edward VI, the male heir Henry had desperately wanted. For a moment, it seemed like everything was perfect, but what most people don't realize is that Jane's triumph was short-lived. After giving birth to Edward, Jane fell ill, perhaps from complications of the birth, or perhaps from something more insidious. Within days, she died. The joy of having an heir quickly turned into overwhelming grief. Henry's sorrow over Jane's death was unlike anything he had experienced before. For the first time, he had gotten what he wanted, but it came at the cost of the woman he loved. He was devastated, and in the midst of this grief, one thing became painfully clear. Jane was the one who gave him what no other woman could, the male heir who would solidify the Tudor line. But was this all Jane's role was meant to be? Or was there more to her relationship with Henry than just securing a son? Here's where things get complicated. Jane Seymour, in many ways, was the one woman who gave Henry what he wanted. But was that all she was to him? Was she simply a vessel for the continuation of his dynasty? Or was there something more? The fact that she was the only wife Henry didn't divorce, she died shortly after childbirth, suggests that, at least for a time, Jane was the one Henry truly mourned. But after her death, Henry's emotional devastation was so deep that he never married again in the same way. Perhaps Jane represented the true love that Henry had been seeking all along, something that transcended politics or succession. It's a tragic twist, considering that her role was primarily viewed as a solution to his dynastic crisis. But could there have been more to her than just that? It's important to remember that Jane's story is often overshadowed by the subsequent reign of her son, Edward VI. While her role as the mother of a king might seem clear-cut, it's Jane's personal relationship with Henry that remains shrouded in mystery. Did Henry see her as more than just a necessary wife? Was she the true queen in his heart, despite the political necessity of her role? Some historians argue that Jane was Henry's ideal match, a woman who gave him peace and stability when his life was marked by chaos. Others claim that she was simply the answer to his succession problems, and that the deep affection Henry felt for her was fueled more by her ability to deliver a male heir than any true emotional bond. Here's the most controversial thought. Jane may have been more than just a political pawn, yet her love story with Henry is often reduced to the legacy of the son she gave him. The grief Henry felt over her death certainly suggests that he saw her as more than just a step in securing his throne. But in the end, Jane's story was overshadowed by the tragedy of her premature death and the immense weight of her legacies. Her son Edward VI, who would rule for a mere 6 years before dying young, and formidable ruler, his sister Elizabeth. What did Jane truly represent in Henry's life? Was she the woman who could have brought him true happiness? Or was she the one who simply fulfilled a duty? In a court filled with political intrigue and ruthless ambition, Jane was a calm presence. She was the one Henry didn't have to fight with, the one who gave him what he wanted, and then, tragically, was taken from him. The heartache Henry felt after Jane's death cannot be understated. It was a deep personal sorrow, but also a moment that marked the end of his search for the perfect wife. None of his subsequent marriages ever held the same emotional significance. So, could it be that, despite everything, Jane Seymour was Henry's true love? A love that came too late, a love that was fleeting but genuine, perhaps, but we'll never truly know. What we do know is that her death marked a turning point for Henry VIII. His obsession with heirs didn't end, but his quest for love had shifted. Jane Seymour's brief life and tragic death left a lasting imprint on Henry VIII and on the future of England. She was the quiet queen who secured the Tudor dynasty, but at what cost? Could she have been more to Henry than just the mother of Edward VI? The legacy she left behind is full of questions that may never be answered, but one thing is certain. Jane Seymour was the queen who gave Henry exactly what he wanted and was ultimately lost too soon. Anne of Cleves was a name often overshadowed by the dramatic and tumultuous reign of Henry VIII, but her story holds a key lesson in how power, politics, and personal preferences intertwine to shape royal history. The marriage between Henry and Anne is often seen as a failure, a blip on the radar of his many marriages. But But what if it wasn't really a failure at all? What if the failure was rooted in something deeper than mere attraction, or lack thereof? Henry's fourth marriage was a political match. Anne of Cleves was from a powerful family in Germany, and her marriage to Henry was meant to solidify alliances with Europe. In theory, it was a smart move for Henry, as it bolstered England's standing in the ever-shifting world of European diplomacy. But what Henry hadn't counted on was the immediate disappointment he would feel upon meeting Anne in person. He had heard much about her beauty and grace, but when the two finally met, Henry was shocked by her appearance. He famously claimed that Anne was not as he had been led to believe, and that she wasn't as attractive as the portrait painted of her. The marriage was doomed from the start. Henry, who had been so eager to marry Anne for political reasons, quickly realized that he could not go through with it, or at least not in the way he had imagined. The contrast between the image he had in his mind and the woman who stood before him was enough to create an immediate, almost visceral disconnection. What followed was a quick annulment after just a few months of marriage, leaving Anne once again a free woman, but with a tarnished reputation. However, there's much more beneath the surface of this seemingly failed marriage. Here's the strange fact that often gets overlooked. Despite the annulment, Henry and Anne were actually on very good terms afterward. Anne became one of Henry's closest allies among his wives. She was even invited to court after the marriage ended, and they remained friends for life. The idea that Henry had been fooled into marrying a woman he found unattractive doesn't capture the full picture of Anne's role in Tudor England. Anne's marriage to Henry wasn't a failure in the traditional sense. Politically, she was able to secure her position and maintain her influence. Anne of Cleves managed to navigate a disastrous marriage with a powerful king, and in the end, she was one of the few wives who did not meet a tragic end. So, what really went wrong with this marriage? Was it all about Henry's personal preferences, or was it more than that? Politics, it turns out, played a huge role in this failed marriage. Anne of Cleves was chosen for her political importance, but the attraction, or lack thereof, was a personal obstacle that neither of them had foreseen. For Henry, the pressure of his own desires and his obsession with finding the perfect wife, one who could provide him with a male heir, was at odds with the political reasons behind the match. He wanted the ideal wife, the one who could fulfill all his needs, but Anne was never meant to be that person. Was this marriage really a failure, or was it just an example of how political and personal interests rarely align in a way that satisfies everyone? For Anne, the annulment was a political victory. She left the marriage unscathed and with a strong position at court. In contrast, Henry's quest for the perfect queen continued, but Anne's story showed how difficult it was for him to balance personal desires with the realities of ruling a kingdom. And here's the controversial thought: Henry's pursuit of love and perfection in his marriages might have been more of a personal flaw than a king's duty to his country. Anne of Cleves was a political success. She played her role well and came out of the marriage with more influence than many would have expected. But for Henry, who was so caught up in his quest for the ideal wife, Anne's failure in his eyes might have been more about his own unrealistic expectations than anything she did wrong. While her marriage to Henry was politically beneficial and gave her a lasting place in Tudor society, it was also a reminder of the pitfalls of marrying for reasons that didn't align with true compatibility. For Henry, it was another failed attempt at securing the perfect queen. But for Anne, it was a moment of resilience, showing that even in the face of disappointment and public scrutiny, a woman could survive and even thrive in the male-dominated world of the Tudor court. After her annulment from Henry, Anne of Cleves didn't just fade into the background. She maintained her dignity and position, living a long life, which is rare for the wives of Henry VIII. She was able to avoid the tragic ends that befell some of Henry's other wives, and emerged as one of the most stable figures in his chaotic marital history. Anne's story isn't just about failure. It's about how the political games and personal desires of the royal court shaped her life. She wasn't the ideal queen in Henry's eyes, but she was a survivor, and in the end, that's what truly mattered. So, next time you think about Henry's fourth marriage, remember, not every royal marriage was a tragedy, and Anne of Cleves proves that a failed marriage doesn't always have to end in disaster. She managed to carve out a life of comfort and influence long after the marriage was over, making her one of the most successful women at Henry's court. Despite everything, Katherine Howard's fate is one of the most tragic stories of Henry VIII's marriages. She was young, beautiful, and full of life when she caught Henry's eye, but her story would end in a way that few could have imagined. Katherine's infidelity led to her execution, but was she truly guilty, or was she simply a victim of her time? This is a question that has haunted historians and people alike, as her life in the royal court was full of promise, but the pressures of being Henry's wife led her to a heartbreaking downfall. The first thing to understand about Katherine Howard is that she was young, only around 16 years old when she caught the attention of the king. Henry was well into his 40s by this time, and had already been through 3 marriages. He was a man desperate to regain the vigor of his younger years, and Katherine, with her youthful beauty, was exactly what he sought. But despite her outward innocence, Katherine's position as queen was anything but innocent. She was a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand, and her impulsive actions would cost her dearly. Here's the strange fact about Katherine's situation. Despite her youthful appearance and charm, Katherine Howard was not a naive girl caught in a web of royal intrigue. In fact, she had a past. Before becoming queen, Katherine had been involved in multiple sexual relationships with men, some of whom were still at court when she married Henry. This fact, though little known, complicates the narrative of Catherine as a completely innocent victim. While Henry may have fallen for her youthful charm, Catherine's previous liaisons soon became her undoing. But did Henry know about these relationships when he married her? It was only after Catherine had been crowned queen that her past came to light. Her former lover, Francis Derham, and another man named Thomas Culpeper were both implicated in a scandal that threatened the very foundation of Catherine's marriage. The pressure of being queen, and of being married to a king with a notorious temper, was immense. Catherine found herself trapped in a situation that she had no control over. She had no choice but to confess her past, but her confession only sealed her fate. What followed was a trial and a public execution. But here's the controversial fact. Henry VIII's treatment of Catherine Howard might not have been as black and white as it's often portrayed. Many believe that Catherine's execution was as much a result of her youthful naivety as it was of the political pressures she faced. Was she truly guilty of adultery, or was she simply another victim of Henry's need for control and his growing paranoia about betrayal? Henry was notorious for his erratic behavior, and Catherine's fate can be seen as another example of his ability to destroy lives in pursuit of his own desires. Catherine's story, even more tragic, is the fact that she had little choice in her downfall. The young queen was isolated, pressured, and manipulated by powerful men at court, and she had to navigate a world where her every move was scrutinized. It's hard to say how much Catherine was responsible for her actions, and how much was the pressure of living up to the expectations of the court. In many ways, her story is a reminder of the dangers of courtly life, where survival was not just about loyalty, but about playing a game that was often deadly. But was Catherine truly guilty, or was her fate determined by the court's need to maintain control over the queen's role, and Henry's obsessive desire to ensure his own authority was never questioned? Truth is, Catherine was caught up in a web of intrigue, deceit, and personal ambition, and her youthful mistakes were magnified by the high-stakes world of Tudor politics. In the end, Catherine's execution was not just about her actions, but about the very nature of Henry's court, a court where the personal whims of the king dictated life and death. Catherine's story, while tragic, serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers women faced in the Tudor court. From the outside, her marriage to Henry VIII may have seemed like the pinnacle of success, but the reality was much darker. She had been given a role to play, but one that was not within her control. The consequences of her mistakes, both personal and political, were far-reaching, and they ended in the brutal execution of a young woman who had only just begun to live. Her story raises an even deeper question. How much of Catherine's fate was a result of her own choices, and how much was shaped by the relentless pressures of the court? Was Catherine a willing participant in her own destruction, or was she simply another casualty of the complex, dangerous politics of the Tudor dynasty? Catherine Howard's life and death were tragic, but they are also a stark reflection of the harsh realities of courtly life. Her story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition, the price of loyalty, and the cost of personal mistakes in a world where political survival was often the only way to stay alive. Catherine, for all her beauty and promise, was just another pawn in a game played by the powerful men around her. Her fate is a haunting reminder of what can happen when royal ambition and youthful ignorance collide, and it's a story that continues to captivate us, even centuries after her execution. Catherine Parr is often considered the lucky one, the wife who survived Henry VIII, outlasting him by several years. But luck alone doesn't explain how Catherine managed to not only survive the tyrannical king, but also navigate the dangerous waters of Tudor court life. Was it pure chance, or did Catherine play a clever game of survival? The story is filled with drama, diplomacy, and intelligence, traits that made her the only wife to outlive Henry, despite the many dangers surrounding her. Let's start with Catherine's background. She wasn't your typical Tudor queen. Catherine had already been married twice before meeting Henry. Her first husband, Edward Burrough, died while they were still very young, and her second, John Neville, passed away while she was still in her 20s. It was her experience as a widow that gave her the wisdom and resilience needed to handle Henry's unpredictable nature. In many ways, her prior marriages equipped her with the tools to survive in the treacherous waters of the Tudor court. What's fascinating about Catherine Parr is how she was deeply involved in the intellectual life of the time and had a strong interest in religion. When Henry's health began to deteriorate, Catherine's knowledge and position in his court made her invaluable. She was not just a companion, she was a nurse, a confidant, and a political ally. This ability to navigate the dangers of Henry's court, combined with her diplomatic skill, meant she could endure the personal and political upheavals that were common in Henry's reign. Catherine's intelligence wasn't the only reason she outlasted Henry. Her personal charm and grace helped her avoid the pitfalls that had doomed so many of Henry's previous wives, and she was able to maintain her position by skillfully managing Henry's temper and, most importantly, keeping a distance from the power struggles that defined the Tudor dynasty. There's more at play here. Catherine's marriage to Henry wasn't just about love or duty, it was about survival. This brings us to a strange and little-known fact. Catherine Parr was the first woman in England to write a book under her own name. At a time when women were generally not allowed to express themselves publicly, Catherine's work stood as a testament to her intelligence and independence. One of her most famous works, The Lamentation of a Sinner, was a religious treatise that demonstrated her understanding of theology and her commitment to the Protestant Reformation, a belief system that would soon become central to England's future. However, this intellectual independence was not without its dangers. Catherine's Protestant sympathies put her at odds with some powerful figures at court, including Thomas More and other conservatives who were staunch defenders of Catholicism. In fact, her Protestant leanings were so controversial that at one point she faced accusations of heresy, something that could have cost her life. Catherine had mastered the art of survival. She remained a key figure in Henry's court, and her influence continued to grow as the king's health declined. What sets Catherine apart from Henry's other wives is her unique ability to stay grounded in the ever-changing political landscape. While the other wives were often consumed by their own ambitions or struggles for power, Catherine focused on one thing: her survival. She didn't make enemies, and she was skilled in the delicate art of diplomacy. As Henry's health deteriorated, Catherine's role became even more crucial. She was entrusted with caring for him, managing his affairs, and maintaining stability within the court. Her ability to soothe the troubled king and keep his temper in check was a key factor in her survival. But what does this say about her marriage to Henry? While many of Henry's other marriages were marked by passion, betrayal, and ambition, Catherine's marriage was more about duty. She cared for Henry in his final years, when he was frail, ill, and increasingly tyrannical. But Catherine wasn't just a passive figure in the marriage. She actively shaped the direction of England. Her intellectual background, her care for Henry, and her ability to maintain stability at court meant that she was a force to be reckoned with. Despite her brilliance and diplomacy, Catherine Parr's survival wasn't just about politics or intellect. It was also about luck. Her marriage to Henry was plagued by the same instability and dangers that had marked his previous unions. But Catherine was able to navigate these challenges with grace and wisdom, something that made her stand out in a world where many others were consumed by the king's volatile temper. As Henry's health began to fail, Catherine's influence grew, but it was her skill in handling the court and Henry's ever-changing desires that allowed her to remain safe from the same fate that befell her predecessors. One of the most remarkable things about Catherine's story is that after Henry's death, she didn't just disappear into the background. Instead, she remarried, this time to Thomas Seymour, the brother of Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife. This new marriage, while politically advantageous, was fraught with its own challenges, but it was a testament to Catherine's resilience and ability to thrive in a world that had already taken so much from her. She went on to live a relatively peaceful life after Henry's death, outlasting many others who had once held power. In the end, Catherine Parr's survival was not due to mere luck. It was the result of a combination of intelligence, diplomacy, and a keen understanding of the dangers surrounding her. She had the foresight to remain politically astute, the patience to navigate Henry's volatile court, and the wisdom to keep her enemies at bay. Her ability to outlive Henry and remain influential in his court serves as a powerful reminder of the complex dynamics of Tudor politics, where survival often depended on more than just marriage. It depended on sheer will and cunning. Catherine Parr's life after Henry's death was far from dull. She took on new roles and continued to make her mark on English society. But it is her time as Henry's queen, her ability to outlast him and remain a figure of stability, that truly defines her legacy. She wasn't just another wife. She was a survivor, and her story is a remarkable testament to her resilience and skill in navigating the treacherous waters of Tudor politics. Henry VIII's break from the Catholic Church wasn't just a personal decision. It was a defining moment in English history. His desire to marry Anne Boleyn, his second wife, set off a chain of events that would forever alter the religious landscape of Europe. But the question remains, how did his personal life lead to such a monumental shift in history? The dissolution of England's ties with Rome wasn't just about Henry's marriages. It was about power, control, and the future of a nation. The world watched as Henry VIII used his marriages as a political tool, and the results were both dramatic and far-reaching. At the heart of this religious revolution was Henry's marriage to Katherine of Aragon, his first wife. Catherine, a devout Catholic, had been married to Henry's older brother Arthur before his death. When Henry ascended the throne, he married her to secure an alliance with Spain. But as time passed and Catherine failed to provide a male heir, Henry grew desperate for a son to secure his dynasty. This desire for a male heir, which we've seen throughout Henry's marriages, led him to a critical decision: divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. However, the Catholic Church refused to annul the marriage, citing religious laws that prohibited such actions. Henry's solution was drastic. He broke away from the Catholic Church and established the Church of England. This move wasn't just about Anne. It was about a king's need for power, control, and legitimacy. Most people think that Henry VIII's break from Rome was all about his love for Anne Boleyn, but the reality is far more complex. Yes, Anne was the catalyst, but Henry's true motivation lay in his need to control both his personal life and the political landscape of England. By creating a new church, Henry not only gained the power to divorce and remarry as he pleased, but he also solidified his authority over religious matters in England. This was a crucial move in consolidating royal power, and it set the stage for the religious upheaval that would follow. His desire for control extended beyond his marriages. It affected the very foundation of England's government and society. As Henry's marriage to Anne ended in disaster, his next marriages were marked by political and religious tensions. His brief marriage to Anne of Cleves, which was annulled after just 6 months, was yet another another attempt to solidify his political position. But Anne wasn't the answer to his needs, and their annulment was a humiliation for both Henry and his court. The dissolution of his marriage to Anne wasn't just a personal failure, it was a direct result of the political maneuvering that defined Henry's reign. Henry's marriages were not just about love, they were about survival, power, and religious control. The religious ramifications of Henry's marriages extended far beyond his own reign. The Church of England, which was founded on the ashes of his marriage to Catherine and his subsequent break from Rome, would become a key player in the future of England. The split from Rome created a Protestant nation, and it shaped the religious landscape of Europe for generations. Henry's actions weren't just about satisfying his personal desires, they were about shaping the future of England and its relationship with the Catholic Church. His establishment of the Church of England allowed his successors to continue his religious reforms, and it sparked a wave of religious change that would spread throughout Europe. It's also crucial to consider the impact of Henry's actions on his children. His male heir, Edward VI, was briefly king, but he died young, leaving England in the hands of his sisters. The political and religious upheaval that followed Henry's death was a direct result of his marriages and the legacy he left behind. Mary I, his daughter by Katherine of Aragon, would return England to Catholicism during her reign, and it was Elizabeth I, Henry's daughter by Anne Boleyn, who would solidify the Protestant faith in England, completing the religious revolution that Henry had started. These power struggles between his children were not just about religious beliefs, they were about the survival of the monarchy and the control of the nation. As we look back on Henry's marriages, we realize that they were not just personal relationships, they were deeply intertwined with political power, religious control, and the future of England. Henry's need for a male heir was a driving force behind his decisions, but it was his desire for absolute power that ultimately led to the creation of the Church of England. The dissolution of his marriages, the political fallout, and the religious revolution that followed reshaped England for generations. By the end of this video, you'll have a clearer understanding of how Henry VIII's marriages were not just about his own desires, but about his ambition to control not only his personal life, but also the religious and political future of England. What may have seemed like a king's love story is actually a story of power, betrayal, and the high cost of ambition. It's a story that changed the course of history and set the stage for one of the most transformative eras in England's history. Henry VIII was a king who could not be satisfied. His marriages, filled with drama, political intrigue, and personal turmoil, were more than just a royal love story. They were the building blocks of a nation in crisis. The shockwaves from his decisions shaped not only his reign, but the future of England. It all began with his desire for a male heir. Henry's obsession with securing a legitimate successor was more than just a royal duty. It was a need that seemed to consume him. The fate of England rested in the hands of one woman, Katherine of Aragon. Her inability to provide Henry with a son, coupled with the political pressures of the time, set off a chain reaction that would forever change the course of English history. You might think that Henry's desire for an heir was the sole reason behind his divorces and tumultuous marriages. But what if I told you that this king's actions were far more complex? The break with Rome, the founding of the Church of England, and the shifting tides of political alliances were all tied to Henry's marital decisions. In the end, his relentless pursuit of power and control led to a religious revolution that changed not only England's religious landscape, but also Europe's. So what was the true cost of these marriages? What happened to the kingdom Henry left behind? And how did his actions affect his children, his wives, and the future of England? By the end of this video, you will uncover the shocking truths behind these 6 marriages that will change how you see Henry VIII and the turbulent era he defined. When Henry first married Katherine of Aragon, he thought he had made the perfect match. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, and their union was meant to strengthen England's ties with one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. But as years passed, Catherine failed to provide Henry with a male heir. After 6 pregnancies, only one child, a daughter, had survived. For Henry, a daughter was not enough. His ambition, his need for a son to secure his dynasty, led him to seek a divorce from Catherine. Here's where it gets really interesting. Catherine of Aragon refused to accept this divorce. As a deeply religious woman, she could not bear the thought of being abandoned by her husband. She fought tooth and nail to retain her position as queen. But Henry was determined to marry Anne Boleyn, a woman he believed could provide him with a son. This decision was not just about love. It was about power, control, and securing the future of his dynasty. And this is where things took a dark turn. When the Pope refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine, the king did something revolutionary. He broke away from the Catholic Church, creating the Church of England. You might think that Henry's move to create a new church was purely religious, but in reality, it was a political move to give him the power to divorce and marry as he pleased. By doing so, he solidified his control over both the church and the state. It was about more than just religion. It was about absolute power. As the story of Henry's marriages unfolds, we see the repercussions of his decisions. The church he created would shape England for centuries. But what about the women behind these marriages? Were they victims of Henry's ambitions, or did they play their part in shaping the drama that unfolded? Take Anne Boleyn, for example. She caught Henry's eye with her beauty, wit, and determination. But what people often overlook is that Anne's marriage to Henry was more than a love story. It was a political move that altered the course of English history. Anne's rise to power led to England's break from the Catholic Church, but it also led to her downfall. She gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, but failed to provide the much-desired male heir. Her downfall was swift and brutal. Accused of treason and adultery, she was executed. But Anne's legacy did not end there. Her daughter Elizabeth would go on to become one of England's greatest monarchs, but this didn't come easily. Elizabeth was born into a world of religious and political chaos, shaped by her father's actions. Her reign, marked by religious upheaval and the defeat of the Spanish Armada, was a direct result of the decisions made by Henry VIII. His marriages shaped the path for England's future monarchs, and his influence stretched far beyond his lifetime. But Henry's story isn't just about love, betrayal, and politics. It's about survival. After Anne Boleyn's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour, who finally gave him the male heir he so desperately wanted, Edward VI. But Jane's story is far more tragic than people realize. She died just days after giving birth, leaving Henry grief-stricken. Was Jane his true love, or was she simply the solution to his succession problem? The truth is, Henry never truly recovered from Jane's death. His marriages after her were more about political alliances than anything else. Take Anne of Cleves, for example. Their marriage was based on political necessity, but Henry was disappointed when he met her. The marriage was annulled after just 6 months, leaving Henry once again searching for the perfect wife. His fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was young and beautiful, but her affair with another man led to her execution. Henry's sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, was a survivor who outlived him, proving that she had the wit and intelligence to navigate the dangers of Henry's court. But what do we learn from Henry's marriages? It's not just a story of royal intrigue and personal desires. It's a story of ambition, power, and survival. Henry's quest for a male heir, his religious revolution, and his changing desires shaped the kingdom he left behind. Anglicides, particularly Mary I and Elizabeth I, inherited the political and religious legacy of their father. Their reigns were marked by their own struggles for power, as they sought to solidify their place in a kingdom forever shaped by their father's actions. By the end of this video, you'll see Henry VIII as more than just a tyrant. He was a man whose personal desires set the stage for one of the most transformative eras in history. His marriages were not just about love, they were about survival, power, and the future of England. And while we may never know the true motivations behind Henry's actions, we do know this: his legacy continues to shape the course of history. Henry VIII, one of England's most infamous kings, is often remembered for his 6 marriages, which resulted in the dramatic downfall of 2 queens, political turmoil, and the foundation of the Church of England. His insatiable drive to secure a male heir and his ruthless pursuit of power led him to make decisions that changed not only his own life, but the entire course of history. In this section, we'll examine how Henry's marriages weren't merely personal or about love. They were deeply tied to his desire for control, for political power, and for the survival of his dynasty. When we think of Henry, we often imagine him as a man driven by passion, a king who couldn't stay married. But what if the story is more complex than that? It's easy to see Henry's marriages as a series of romantic entanglements gone wrong, but the reality is much darker. Every marriage he made, whether motivated by love, lust, or ambition, was a calculated step in securing the future of England. Though it often came at great personal costs, his decision to divorce, behead, or annul his wives caused ripples that impacted his children and shaped the English monarchy for generations. Now, let's take a closer look at how these marriages played out, starting with his children. He left behind 3 children who each inherited the throne in their turn. Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. Decisions. Edward VI was Henry's only legitimate son, the one he'd been desperate to have. But Edward's reign was short-lived, as he died young, and his death set off a series of succession crises. His death led to the reigns of both his sisters Mary I and Elizabeth I, each of whom faced challenges rooted in the decisions made by their father. Mary I, often remembered as Bloody Mary, struggled with religious upheaval and a kingdom divided over Protestantism and Catholicism. Despite being Henry's only surviving child from his first marriage to Katherine of Aragon, Mary's legitimacy as queen was constantly questioned. Her reign, filled with religious persecution, stemmed directly from Henry's break with Rome. Then there's Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth's reign is often seen as a golden age for England, a time of great artistic, cultural, and military achievements. She became one of England's most beloved monarchs, but the fear of being overthrown and the religious turmoil left behind by her father's marriages would shape her decisions and policies. Was Henry's desire for a male heir truly the only thing that drove him? The answer is more complicated than it seems. Yes, Henry wanted a male heir to secure his dynasty, but his actions went beyond that. He wasn't just trying to make sure England had a strong male successor. He was creating alliances, maintaining his power, and in many cases, making decisions that ensured his personal ambitions came first. Catherine, his first wife. Catherine was the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, and their marriage was designed to strengthen the alliance between England and Spain. But after years of marriage, Henry grew frustrated with Catherine's inability to produce a male heir. His desire for a son led him to seek an annulment, which ultimately led to the creation of the Church of England. He couldn't accept that a marriage, made for political reasons, wasn't giving him what he needed, a male successor. But Catherine fought fiercely to maintain retain her position as queen, and her refusal to accept a divorce put Henry on a collision course with the Catholic Church. This divorce not only marked the end of Henry's marriage to Catherine, but it set in motion the religious upheaval that would forever change England. Henry's break with Rome, driven by his desire for a divorce, created the Church of England and severed England's ties to the Catholic Church. What started as a personal struggle for a male heir turned into a religious revolution that would have a profound impact on England for centuries. This is where Henry's personality becomes a key factor. He wasn't just a king driven by the simple desire for an heir. He was a monarch whose temper and impatience with those who defied him often led to extreme measures. When things didn't go according to his plan, he could be ruthless. 2 of his wives were executed, and his fluctuating political alliances often led to deadly consequences for those around him. In fact, Henry's ruthless nature wasn't just a consequence of his desire for control. It also reflected a deeper need for validation. Throughout his reign, he faced a world where his power and legacy were constantly questioned. His marriages weren't just about securing a son or a queen. They were about securing his legacy and maintaining control over the English throne. But what did this mean for the women involved in these marriages? Henry's wives were not passive figures in his story. They played crucial roles, not just as his consorts, but as political pawns, survivors, and tragic figures in their own right. Each wife had to navigate the dangers of Henry's court, where failure could mean death or disgrace. Take Anne Boleyn, for example. She is often portrayed as a victim of Henry's passion, a queen who was caught in a whirlwind of ambition and political intrigue. But her story is much more complex. Anne was a woman who understood the political landscape and used her charm and intelligence to secure a position as queen. She played her part in the downfall of her predecessor, Katherine of Aragon, but in doing so, she became a victim of the very ambition she once embraced. Anne was executed on charges of adultery, treason, and incest, charges that are still debated by historians today. But was Anne a victim of her time, or was she complicit in the political drama that surrounded her rise and fall? For Jane Seymour, her role as Henry's third wife is steeped in tragedy. She gave Henry the male heir he so desperately wanted, Edward VIII, but she died shortly after childbirth. Her death marked a turning point in Henry's life, as he mourned the loss of the one wife who had provided him with a son. Was Jane truly his one great love, or was she just a stepping stone to securing the future of his dynasty? Catherine Howard, on the other hand, met a tragic end due to infidelity. Though Catherine was young and beautiful, she was executed for having an affair. But the reality of her situation was far more complex. Catherine Howard was a product of a courtly environment that valued beauty and ambition, but lacked the stability needed to survive under Henry's rule. Did she deserve the fate she met, or was she simply a victim of her circumstances? And then there's Catherine Parr, the woman who outlived Henry. Catherine Parr's intelligence, diplomatic skills, and ability to navigate the dangers of Henry's court allowed her to survive longer than any of his other wives. Catherine wasn't just a survivor. She was a woman who understood Henry's vulnerabilities and played the game better than anyone else. Henry's reign wasn't just about his marriages. It was about the complex web of political, religious, and personal ambitions that defined his rule. His actions reshaped the religious landscape of England, influenced the monarchies of Europe, and left a legacy that affected future generations. His marriages were more than personal choices. They were decisions that shaped the world. The role of women in Henry VIII's court was complex and heavily influenced by the king's own whim. While these women held immense power as queens, their fates were ultimately tied to their ability to please the king. They had to be astute, navigating a political world dominated by the king's desires, shifting loyalties, and expectations. At the time, marriage was not just about love. It was often about survival, alliance, and securing political power. Henry's marriages in particular were steeped in this context. Women like Katherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and Catherine Parr had to contend with political pressures, personal ambition, and the ever-present threat of falling out of favor. The lives of Henry's wives offer a stark contrast when it comes to how women in power were treated. The Tudor court was a dangerous place, and a queen's position could be easily upended if she failed to meet the king's expectations. But did Henry's wives bear the full brunt of his whims, or were they also active players in the game of power and survival? Let's start with Katherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. She was a princess, strong, determined, and deeply religious. And when Henry grew tired of her after years of marriage, he sought an annulment, a process that was far more than just a personal rejection. Catherine fought fiercely to retain her title as queen, and she did so with dignity. She refused to accept the annulment and held firm in her belief that their marriage was valid. Her refusal wasn't just about personal pride. It was about survival in a court where political influence depended on her position. Anne Boleyn's rise to queen was similarly tied to her political savvy. She wasn't just a beautiful woman who caught Henry's eye and through the game of court politics and used it to her advantage. She outmaneuvered Catherine of Aragon, despite the risks, and secured her place as queen. But once in power, Anne had to navigate her new role carefully, dealing with Henry's changing affections and the pressure to produce a male heir. While Anne's ambition was clear, she was also subject to the court's demands, and her tragic downfall, charged with adultery and treason, illustrates how precarious a queen's position could be. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, was another example of a woman whose fate was shaped by her ability to conform to the king's desires. Catherine, young and beautiful, was initially seen as a a refreshing contrast to Henry's older wives. However, her affair with another man before her marriage and her later infidelities led to her execution. Her execution, like Anne's, reveals the dangers of being a woman in power in Henry's court, caught between personal ambition and the perilous demands of the king. Then, there's Katherine Parr, the one wife who survived Henry and outlived him. Katherine's survival wasn't just due to luck, it was a testament to her intelligence, diplomacy, and ability to adapt. She was a widow twice before marrying Henry, but she navigated the complexities of Henry's court with grace and tact. While Katherine Parr may have avoided the tragic fates of some of Henry's other wives, her position as queen was still precarious. She had to balance her relationship with the king, handle his deteriorating health, and secure her own future in a court where loyalty was always in question. The experiences of Henry's wives reflect a broader trend in Tudor England, where the lives of women in power were shaped by their relationships with the king. While these women were queens and wielded considerable power, they were often subjected to the whims of a king whose desires and needs came first. A queen's survival in Henry's court was often determined by her ability to navigate a system that valued personal loyalty, beauty, and political savvy above all else. But how much of their fate was determined by their own actions, and how much was shaped by the demands and expectations of the time? There's a fascinating paradox in the story of Henry's wives. On one hand, these women were powerful figures who held high status. On the other, they were always one mistake or misstep away from falling out of favor and perhaps losing everything. Katherine of Aragon's refusal to accept a divorce, Anne Boleyn's ambition, Catherine Howard's youthful folly, and Katherine Parr's careful navigation of court politics all show how women in Henry's time had to constantly adapt to survive. But it's also clear that while they were subject to Henry's whims, these women were far from passive players. They shaped the course of history through their marriages, their decisions, and their survival strategies. Katherine of Aragon's unyielding defense of her marriage to Henry led to the English Reformation. Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth I, would go on to become one of England's most famous and successful monarchs. Katherine Parr's marriage to Henry helped her secure a future for herself and her family. Even after the king's death, these women were not just victims of the system. They were active participants in shaping the course of their lives and the future of England. However, their survival came at a high cost, often involving manipulation, political maneuvering, and sometimes tragedy. The role of women in Henry's court was complex, often defined by the tension between power and vulnerability, ambition and survival. What these women endured and how they navigated their roles offers a fascinating glimpse into the turbulent world of the Tudor court. The legacy of Henry's wives and the role they played in the political landscape of the time cannot be underestimated. They were queens, but they were also survivors, each playing a crucial role in the unfolding drama of Henry VIII's reign. Their stories are more than just personal tales of love and loss. They are about power, politics, and survival in one of the most dangerous courts in history. Henry VIII's relationships with his wives were far more than romantic entanglements. They were intricate power plays, fraught with betrayal, ambition, and survival. In his court, women wielded immense influence, but that power was fragile. As queens, they had the ability to shape history, but at any given moment, their fates were inextricably tied to the whims of the king. It wasn't just about loyalty to Henry, it was about political maneuvering, survival, and the changing tides of court life. The role of women in Henry's marriages tells us a lot about the way power functioned in Tudor England. On the surface, Henry's wives were powerful women, each crowned queen. Yet beneath that regal title, they were often at the mercy of Henry's desires, both personal and political. While these women had the privilege of royal status, they were also limited by their roles as wives of a king whose unpredictable nature made the royal court a perilous place. Henry's first wife was a woman of royal Spanish blood, with a strong sense of duty. She was deeply devout and devoted to her role as queen, but her inability to provide Henry with a male heir would become her undoing. For years, she fought fiercely to maintain her marriage and her position as queen, refusing to accept Henry's annulment. She did this not just out of personal pride, but because she understood the power of her position and the political instability that would result if she lost it. Her refusal to comply, her unwavering belief in the validity of their marriage, was a statement against the very system that depended on a woman's submission. Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, represents the other side of this equation. She wasn't just a passive figure in Henry's court. She played the game of ambition and power with the best of them. She had the wit, beauty, and intelligence to catch Henry's eye, and once she did, she used it to secure the throne. But once in power, Anne was under constant pressure to produce a male heir, a role she could not fulfill. The political and religious chaos that surrounded her marriage didn't make her life easier either. She was executed on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, although many historians argue that these charges were fabricated. In reality, Anne was the tragic victim of royal ambition, her political survival doomed by her failure to deliver a male heir. Then there is Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife. Catherine was young, vibrant, and full of life when she caught Henry's eye. She had the advantage of being a youthful contrast to Henry's older queens, and her marriage to him started with the hope of renewing the king's vitality. But Catherine's fall from grace came in the form of infidelity. Whether it was the result of her naivety or the pressures of being a young woman in Henry's court, she was executed for adultery. But was she truly guilty, or was she a victim of her own youth youth and circumstance? Or was Catherine's infidelity simply a betrayal of Henry's trust? Or was it an unfortunate consequence of the oppressive environment she lived in? The story of Catherine Howard raises difficult questions about the pressures faced by women at court, where ambition and survival often clashed. Now, let's talk about Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife. Catherine was a widow twice before marrying Henry, and she entered the marriage with a sharp understanding of the dangers of being a queen. It was her diplomacy, her intelligence, and her tact that allowed her to survive Henry's volatile reign. Unlike Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr was able to navigate Henry's complex moods, his growing illness, and his declining power with grace. But it wasn't just luck that kept her alive. She knew when to support Henry and when to step back. She proved to be a survivor, but did her survival come at the cost of her own ambitions? What did it take for Catherine Parr to outlast the king? And what does her survival tell us about the complex role women had to play at court? While the fates of these women were shaped by their relationships with Henry, their actions were also determined by the larger political and social forces at play in Tudor England. They were queens, but their positions were fragile. Their power could be easily stripped away if they failed to meet the king's expectations, and many of them, like Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, met tragic ends as a result. These women were also products of a system that valued loyalty, beauty, and political alliances above all else. They had to be astute, clever, and always on the lookout for the slightest shift in Henry's favor. The changing nature of their power shows just how unpredictable life in the Tudor court could be. But were they just victims of Henry's capriciousness, or did they play an active role in shaping their fates? While they might have been constrained by the political landscape, they still had agency. Catherine of Aragon fought for her marriage, Anne Boleyn played a critical role in the English Reformation, and Catherine Parr outlived Henry by carefully navigating the perils of court life. It's easy to view these women as victims, as pawns in Henry's grand plan, but in truth there were much more than that. They had to be politically astute and survive in a court that was as dangerous as it was powerful. Their stories, though tragic, reflect the complexity of power dynamics in Tudor England. Despite the limits placed on them as women, they each found ways to maneuver, to survive, and in some cases, to thrive. In the end, the role of women in Henry's court was a reflection of the larger political and social forces at play during the Tudor era. These women weren't just victims of Henry's rule. They were active participants in the complex dance of power, ambition, and survival that defined this tumultuous period in English history. Henry's marriages were more than royal alliances. They were a powerful mix of survival, betrayal, and strategy. Behind each of Henry VIII's marriages lay a calculated political motive, but these relationships were also deeply personal. The lives of his wives were defined not just by their roles as queens, but by their ability to navigate Henry's ever-shifting desires, court politics, and religious upheaval. It's easy to see these women as victims, but their stories are far more complicated. When Henry first sought out a wife, it wasn't for love, it was for a male heir. The crown's future depended on it, and this desire would be the driving force behind his 6 marriages. But the politics of the time made these marriages much more than a way to secure the throne. They were pivotal moments in history, each one carrying political weight that affected not just England's monarchy, but its very relationship with Europe, the church, and its own people. Let's start with Anne of Cleves, the 4th wife of Henry. She was a political pawn in many ways. Henry was under immense pressure to form an alliance with Germany, and Anne, the daughter of a powerful German duke, seemed like a perfect choice. But when Henry met her, he was horrified by her appearance. She did not live up to the beauty he had been promised. There are even accounts that suggest Henry couldn't even stand to look at her. But was it really Anne's looks that doomed the marriage? Or was it the political realities of the time that made Henry look elsewhere for his next marriage? In truth, it was likely both. Anne wasn't the right match, and Henry was quick to annul their union after just 6 months. But the speed of the annulment, something that shocked even the court, sends a powerful message about the precarious position of women in Henry's court. Anne of Cleves' story might seem like one of failure, but it's not just about her looks. This marriage reveals how power, alliances, and personal desires clashed in Henry's court. Anne, despite the annulment, managed to maintain a dignified and respected position in England. She was not cast aside. She was given the royal title of the king's sister, and even invited to Henry's later weddings. This fact shows the complex political web these women had to navigate. Anne's survival and later comfort stand in stark contrast to the fate of his other wives, who were less fortunate. When you think about Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, it's easy to dismiss it as just another failed union. But there's a crucial lesson here. Henry wasn't just looking for a wife who could bear him children. He was looking for a political advantage, someone who could strengthen his reign and his country's. The failure of the marriage to Anne shows the tensions between personal desires and political realities, a tension that would shape every one of Henry's marriages. Let's also remember that Henry's decision to marry Anne of Cleves was influenced by his breaking with the Catholic Church, something that had far-reaching consequences. The formation of the Church of England and the dissolution of the monasteries were both byproducts of Henry's need to secure his marriage to Anne Boleyn, but also to establish his reign as independent from the Pope. Anne, therefore, was more than just a wife. She was a political statement, and her annulment, while not the dramatic act of defiance it may seem at first, reveals just how deeply entangled his marital decisions were with his quest for power and control. Each of Henry's marriages can be understood not only in personal terms but also as a political maneuver. For Henry, marriage was not just about finding love or companionship, it was about securing his legacy, ensuring his dynasty, and influencing the political landscape of Europe. These were high-stakes games, and for some wives the consequences were deadly. But Anne of Cleves, remarkably, was able to navigate this complex world and emerge with her dignity intact. This section also challenges us to rethink what we know about Henry's relationship with his wives. While it's tempting to focus on their roles as victims of his ambition and whims, it's important to recognize that these women were active players in a high-stakes drama. The stories of Anne of Cleves and the other wives reveal how the lines between personal and political power were blurred during Henry's reign, and how women had to be savvy, resourceful, and above all adaptable to survive. In Anne's case, her marriage might have failed, but her survival and the eventual respect she earned reflects a key aspect of Tudor politics, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. And although her time with Henry was short-lived, she showed the world that the fate of a woman at court wasn't always sealed by one man's whims. What can we learn from Anne of Cleves' stories? It's not just about beauty or political connections, it's about resilience. Anne showed that even when things don't go according to plan, you can still find a way to succeed. Henry VIII's 6 marriages were more than just royal ceremonies. They were political maneuvers that would reshape the course of English history, all driven by one king's desperate need for power, succession, and control. We often think of these unions as part of Henry's personal love story, marriages marked by romantic intrigue and scandal. But the reality is far more complex. These marriages were about power, alliances, and survival. Henry's repeated need for marriage was less about finding love and more about shaping the future of the English monarchy. But what can we learn from the way Henry approached his marriages? From the way he discarded wives to how each marriage impacted England's political landscape, the lessons are striking. In this section, we'll dive deep into the political stakes behind each marriage and analyze the intricate web of power Henry sought to weave with each bride. The first striking element is how Henry's marriages were never about just love. Each wife, he had a specific political or personal goal, whether it was to secure a male heir, strengthen ties with powerful European nations, or navigate religious strife. The first example, Anne of Cleves, shows the importance of marriage as a political tool. She was the 4th wife, and her marriage to Henry was essentially a diplomatic alliance with her German family. Anne was meant to strengthen Henry's ties to Germany, a nation with which England needed support. But when Henry met her, he was disappointed by her appearance. Their marriage was annulled within 6 months. Now, it might seem like a silly reason for annulment. The king's displeasure at his bride's appearance was actually a politically loaded event. Anne of Cleves' marriage was important not only to Henry, but also to the entire Tudor dynasty. Her annulment was not just a simple rejection, but a statement of Henry's control over his kingdom's future. The annulling of the marriage, often seen as a personal failure, was a move that reinforced Henry's dominance in the political sphere. The marriage itself wasn't about affection, it was about securing an alliance, and when it didn't serve its purpose, Henry moved on without hesitation. But here's where things get interesting. Anne, instead of being disgraced, actually benefited from the annulment. She was treated with respect and allowed to live comfortably in England as a sister to the king. She even remained on friendly terms with Henry, which is a rare glimpse of diplomacy in an otherwise tumultuous reign. This outcome tells us something important about Henry's political acumen. While his marriages often ended in tragedy for his wives, the case of Anne of Cleves shows a surprising twist in his treatment of them when politics took precedence over personal preference. But why did Henry continue to marry when it seemed like every union resulted in tension, divorce, or death? Each marriage reflected Henry's relentless desire to shape the future of England according to his vision, and with each new wife, he moved further from the traditional roles of queenship. The story of Anne, and later Catherine Howard, also reveals how the stakes of the Tudor court could be both deadly and politically beneficial. The political stakes were enormous. His marriages were public affairs, each one watched closely by the kingdom and by powerful European neighbors. To many, the marriages of Henry VIII seemed driven by nothing more than his personal desires. But in reality, each union had strategic implications, some more successful than others. For example, Catherine Howard's marriage to Henry was rooted in youthful enthusiasm and attraction, but Catherine's affair with another man would end in her execution, showcasing Henry's growing impatience with anything that threatened his control. Through these marriages, he sought the loyalty and support of foreign kingdoms, securing England's place in the turbulent political landscape of the time. Each marriage was a chess move, a means to an end, whether it was securing peace or alliances, or guaranteeing the continuation of his dynasty. But more often than not, the political stakes were compromised by personal desire or betrayal. A marriage cycle, each one ending either in annulment or death, was not a coincidence. Was it an act of strategy, or just the result of Henry's inability to satisfy his desires? The reality might be a combination of both. His marriages show a pattern of emotional instability, which seemed to fuel the relentless cycle of remarrying. His first wife, Katherine of Aragon, couldn't give him a male heir. Anne Boleyn, after giving him Elizabeth, failed to give him a son, which ultimately led to her execution. Jane Seymour, his third wife, did give him Edward VI, the male heir he craved, but she died shortly after childbirth. Anne of Cleves, whom Henry quickly annulled, was followed by Katherine Howard, a young woman whose infidelity led to her tragic end. But did Henry's desire for power always outweigh his personal desires? His decision to marry Anne of Cleves, an unattractive political match, shows us just how political his marriages really were. He sought to strengthen England's position in Europe and secure an alliance, not to satisfy personal attraction. When the political goal was no longer served, however, he discarded Anne without hesitation. What can we learn from Henry's repeated marriages? The truth is that each marriage was a strategic move in his ongoing campaign for control. But this repetition, each one an effort to fulfill an impossible ideal, reveals a king trapped by his desires. In many ways, Henry's cycle of marriages was a reflection of his desperate attempts to secure a future for himself and his dynasty. The fact that he couldn't find satisfaction in any of his marriages highlights a deep insecurity that affected his reign. As we move through this chapter of history, it's essential to examine how Henry's marriages reflect the pressures of the time. They weren't just about securing love or a male heir. They were about power, loyalty, and control. And for Henry, the cycle never stopped. Each wife was a means to an end, but the ends kept shifting as quickly as his desires. The bigger question remains, was he ever truly satisfied, or was the pursuit of control all he ever wanted? In the next sections, we'll dive deeper into Henry's personal desires and the political consequences of his marriages. But for now, let's reflect on the lessons these marriages offer about power, control, and the lengths one man will go to ensure his legacy. Each marriage tells a different story, but together they reveal the true cost of ambition. Henry VIII's marriages were not only the stuff of royal drama and intrigue, they were powerful political moves, deeply entwined with the very future of England. Each marriage was more than just a relationship. It was a calculated step in his pursuit of power, succession, and control. We will explore the deeper truths behind Henry's cycle of marriages and how they shaped not only his life but also the course of English history. Throughout this story, we will uncover the layers of personal desire and political necessity that drove Henry to marry, divorce, and execute, all in the name of securing his legacy. The drama of Henry's marriages, often seen as personal failures or romantic disappointments, were in fact strategies for a king who was willing to sacrifice anything for the sake of his dynasty. But did these marriages ultimately serve his purpose, or did they cost him everything? Henry's repeated marriages follow a fascinating pattern of seeking power, love, and succession, only to find that each union fell short of his expectations. At the heart of this story is a king who struggled with an inner conflict, his desire for control, and his inability to find true satisfaction in his relationships. But what did these patterns of love, betrayal, and power reveal about Henry's character? Now, let's dive into Henry's marriages and uncover the fascinating truths about the power dynamics at play. While most people think Henry's love life was just about finding the right queen, the reality is that it was about far more: securing England's future, navigating political alliances, and ensuring the survival of the Tudor dynasty. Each of Henry's 6 marriages had a deep strategic purpose, whether it was to consolidate power, secure political alliances, or ensure the legitimacy of his heirs. But how much of this was personal ambition, and how much was political strategy? From his first wife, Katherine of Aragon, to his final wife, Catherine Parr, we'll explore how each marriage played into the larger story of England's rise to power. Take Anne of Cleves, for instance. Henry married her for political reasons, hoping to secure an alliance with Germany. But when he saw her in person, he was disappointed, and the marriage was annulled. Was this really a political failure, or was it just Henry's inability to make decisions based on anything other than his immediate desires? Similarly, Katherine Howard's marriage to Henry seemed to promise something new, but her infidelity led to her execution. What does this say about the pressures and dangers of being a young woman at the Tudor court? Katherine Howard was young and full of life, yet her story ends in scandal and tragedy. How much of this was a personal failing, and how much was it the inevitable result of Henry's harsh demands on those closest to him? Each marriage wasn't just about romance, but also about securing political stability. Henry needed alliances, heirs, and the loyalty of powerful families across Europe. With every divorce and annulment, Henry reshaped England's political landscape, strengthening his control and his legacy. But this came at a cost, not just to his wives, but to the Henry's personal desires often overshadowed the needs of the realm, and the consequences were felt for generations. One of the most fascinating aspects of Henry's marriages is how they shaped the political alliances of Europe. By marrying foreign princesses, Henry strategically placed England in positions of power across the continent. Yet despite these calculated moves, his personal dissatisfaction with his wives often led to the dissolution of these alliances, leaving England with fewer friends and more enemies. The true cost of Henry's marriages wasn't just measured in the political fallout or the religious upheaval they caused. It was also measured in the lives of the women who were caught in his pursuit of a male heir. While these women were often caught between Henry's whims and the court's demands, their personal stories offer a glimpse into the complicated role of women in Tudor society. Were these women simply pawns in a game of power, or did they exercise agency in a court that was defined by male authority? It's easy to think of Henry as a tyrant, someone whose desires led to the suffering of many. But in reality, his marriages reveal a far more complex picture: a king who struggled with deep insecurities, a relentless pursuit of power, and an inability to find true contentment. His marriages reveal not just the fragility fragility of his reign, but the fragility of the human heart when power and personal desire collide. The cycle of marriage, divorce, and execution wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern driven by Henry's desire to create legacy. Each marriage, though marked by love, betrayal, and loss, was part of a larger strategy to ensure the future of the Tudor dynasty. But was this cycle of marriage a result of Henry's emotional instability, or was it a deliberate strategy designed to fulfill his need for control? Through his marriages, Henry sought more than just heirs. He sought power, stability, and a legacy that would last long after his death. But the more he married, the more he revealed the limits of his own control. With each new wife, Henry tried to secure his future, only to find that the very thing he desired most, control, slipped further from his grasp. As we reflect on the true cost of Henry's marriages, it's clear that these unions were not just about love or succession. They were a reflection of a king's desire for power and the tragic consequences of that desire. Each marriage tells a story of ambition, betrayal, and survival, and together they form a portrait of a man who sought to control everything, yet found himself trapped by his own choices. Henry's reign may have been marked by personal failure and public spectacle, but it also set the stage for one of the most transformative periods in English history. His marriages, though filled with scandal and tragedy, played a key role in shaping the political and religious landscape of England for generations to come. In the end, the story of Henry VIII's marriages is not just one of love and loss. It is a story of power, ambition, and the high cost of trying to control the future. And while Henry may have thought that his marriages were the key to securing his legacy, the true lesson lies in how little control we really have over our own fate. By the end of this video, you'll have uncovered the deep, often tragic truths behind Henry VIII's 6 marriages. What may have seemed like a simple story of love and succession is actually filled with power struggles, betrayal, and royal ambition. You now understand the high cost of ambition and how these marriages shaped not only Henry's life, but the entire course of England's history. You can now see Henry VIII as more than just a tyrant. He was a man whose actions and choices set the stage for one of the most transformative eras in history. Henry VIII's 6 marriages were not simply about love, romance, or the pursuit of heirs. They were strategic, complex, and often politically charged. These relationships had lasting effects on the throne, the kingdom, and even Europe as a whole. But why did Henry marry so many women, and how did his marriages reshape the very foundation of England? Most people think Henry's marriages were driven by personal desire, but the reality is far more layered and political. At the time, marriage was a key tool in securing power and alliances, and Henry's marital decisions were no exception. Through these unions, he not only sought to fulfill personal ambitions, but also to secure his legacy as king and preserve the Tudor dynasty. But was the cost of his decisions worth it? Now I will explore how each marriage left an indelible mark on the monarchy and on England's political landscape. Henry's repeated search for the perfect wife reveals a man not driven by love, but by a desperate need for control, both in his personal life and as king. These marriages became the battlegrounds for a king fighting not just for heirs, but for power, survival, and the future of England. Each union was part of a repeating cycle, each marriage reflecting a different chapter of his reign. With every new wife, he sought something he believed he lacked: a political ally, a male heir, or even true love. But did his repeated marriages reveal a deeper pattern, or was each new union a desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable? While most of us know the broad strokes of Henry's reign, his break with Rome, the creation of the Church of England, and his eventual tyrannical rule, there are many aspects that remain little understood. Henry's relationships with his wives were fraught with betrayal, manipulation, and power struggles. Yet, they were also marked by moments of unexpected compassion, grief, and personal vulnerability. What do these marriages reveal about Henry's character and his inability to find satisfaction, both as a king and a man? For Henry, his marriages were much more than personal affairs. They were the lifeblood of his reign, essential to solidifying his control over England and ensuring the future of the Tudor dynasty. But the more he sought control, the more he lost it. Each marriage ended with a shift in power, a reflection of the deep instability Henry faced as he grappled with his own desires and insecurities. Henry's marriages to Katherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr were not just about succession. They were a calculated series of moves, each wife strategically chosen to secure his place on the throne and that of his heirs. But did his constant quest for the right woman ultimately backfire? Let's take a deeper look at the intricate dance of political maneuvering and personal ambition that characterized Henry's reign. Take the case of Anne of Cleves. Henry married her to form a political alliance with Germany, but he was disappointed when he met her in person. Was their marriage doomed from the start, or was it simply a reflection of Henry's changing desires? His willingness to annul the marriage so quickly reveals a key truth about Henry's approach to marriage. It was always about securing what he needed, whether it was love, power, or an heir. On the other hand, Catherine Howard's marriage to Henry seemed full of promise, but ended tragically when she was executed for infidelity. What does this tell us about the dangers of courtly life under Henry's rules? Was Catherine guilty, or was she simply a victim of the pressures placed upon her in Henry's court? The truth may surprise you. Henry's marriages to Catherine Parr, the last of his wives, also provide insight into how he changed over time. Catherine's ability to survive Henry's volatile personality and outlast outlast him speaks to her intelligence and political acumen. But did she play a clever game of survival, or was she just lucky to be in the right place at the right time? As we dive deeper into these marriages, we uncover the political stakes behind Henry's unions. While many historians focus on the love or lack of love in these relationships, we must remember that each marriage was a carefully orchestrated political move. From his first marriage to Katherine of Aragon, a match that sealed an alliance with Spain, to his final marriage to Catherine Parr, who helped heal the rift left by his previous wives, Henry's marriages were as much about diplomacy and control as they were about love. Every marriage had lasting implications for the kingdom, from the religious reforms brought on by Henry's desire to marry Anne Boleyn, to the political and religious shifts that followed each divorce. His actions set in motion a chain of events that would leave a legacy far beyond his lifetime, influencing the politics, religion, and society of England for generations to come. But what does this all tell us about Henry himself? How many view him as a ruthless tyrant. His repeated marriages also show a man caught between his own desires and the demands of his kingdom. Could Henry have been a different ruler had he found true satisfaction in his marriages? What does his story teach us about the dangers of unchecked power and the personal cost of ambition? Ultimately, Henry VIII's marriages were not just personal failures, but political gambits that reshaped the very fabric of England. His pursuit of a male heir, political alliances, and personal desires all played a role in shaping the future of the Tudor dynasty. But did the ends justify the means? What did Henry sacrifice for the sake of his marriages, and were those sacrifices truly worth it? As we close, we realize that Henry's marriages were not just about love, succession, or betrayal. They were the foundation for some of the most significant changes in English history. His marriages, while often seen through the lens of scandal and drama, reveal a king whose personal choices set the course for an entire era. By the end of this video, we understand that the story of Henry VIII's marriages is far more than just a tale of love and loss. It's a tale of power, survival, and the high price of ambition. Henry VIII's 6 marriages have been the subject of intrigue and controversy for centuries. But what if the narrative we all know is not the full story? While many view his marriages as a series of passionate love affairs, the reality is much darker, more political, and far more complex. These marriages were not just about love. They were about power, survival, and control. Henry's relentless quest for a male heir, his marriages to foreign princesses, and his eventual break with the Catholic Church shaped the very future of England. Behind these decisions, there were hidden motivations that had long-lasting effects on the kingdom. From betrayal to heartbreak, the story of Henry's wives is as much about survival as it is about love and loss. You may think that each of Henry's marriages followed a pattern, driven by personal desire, but the truth is, these unions were strategic power moves that were deeply influenced by the political tides of the time. What did Henry's quest for a male heir reveal about his character? Why did he marry some women out of political necessity and others for love? Was he just a man trying to secure his legacy, or a ruler who believed that marriage was his greatest tool for survival? By the end of this video, you'll discover the untold stories behind Henry's relationships, the political stakes that were higher than mere romance, and the tragic consequences that shaped not only his reign, but the future of the monarchy itself. Get ready to dive into the marriages of Henry VIII and uncover the shocking truths behind each of them. We'll begin by exploring the political stakes behind Henry's marriages, starting with his desperate search for a male heir, a pursuit that would drive him to break with the Catholic Church and set England on a new path. This wasn't just about bloodlines. This was about power. Henry's need for a son was far more pressing than many realize. Was the desire for an heir truly the sole reason for his divorces and executions? The answer is much more layered than you might think. Take the case of Katherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. Her marriage to Henry was initially seen as a political alliance, but as time went on, the pressure for a male heir became unbearable. When Catherine failed to give Henry the son he so desperately wanted, it caused a rift that led to one of the most pivotal moments in English history, the break from the Catholic Church. But did Henry's obsession with a male heir truly define his marriages, or was there something more going on behind the scenes? The deeper you look, the more you realize that this issue was not just about succession, it was about control. As we move on to Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, the story takes a dramatic turn. Most people think Anne betrayed Henry, but the reality is much more complicated. She was a woman who challenged the very power structures of the day, and in doing so became a catalyst for religious and political change. Anne gave Henry Elizabeth, but no male heir. So was Anne the victim of royal ambition, or was she simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? As we peel back the layers of Anne's story, we begin to understand the immense pressures placed on her and the disastrous consequences of Henry's shifting desires. And then we come to Jane Seymour, the only wife Henry did not divorce, and the one who gave him the male heir he so desperately wanted. But Jane's death just days after childbirth left Henry devastated. Was Jane truly his love, or was she just the solution to his succession problem? The truth about Henry's feelings for Jane is far from straightforward. Her tragic story is intertwined with the very politics of the Tudor dynasty. Then there's Anne of Cleves, the marriage that was meant to be political but ended in disappointment. Henry was eager for a political alliance with Germany, but when he met Anne in person, he was horrified by her appearance. The marriage was annulled within months. Was this marriage doomed from the start, or was Henry simply looking looking for another excuse to remarry, and how much of this was about politics, and how much was about Henry's personal desires. It's clear that Anne was caught in a system where her value was measured not by who she was, but by what she could provide. Catherine Howard, the young and beautiful cousin of Anne Boleyn, had the misfortune of falling victim to Henry's ever-changing desires. Catherine's marriage to Henry was full of promise, but her infidelity would eventually lead to her execution. Was Catherine guilty of the crimes she was accused of, or was she merely a victim of her time? Was her fate sealed by the pressures of court life, or was her downfall truly her own doing? As we explore Catherine's tragic story, we begin to understand the dangers of living in Henry's court. Final Catherine's survival in a court full of intrigue and danger is a testament to her intelligence and diplomatic skills. But was she just lucky, or did she play a clever game of survival? Her ability to care for Henry during his final years speaks volumes about her character. But was this survival strategy what truly kept her alive? As we look at the ending of Henry's life, we also see the end of his marriages, the culmination of all his choices, all his political maneuvering, and all the lives he affected. The question remains, was it worth it? Through all these marriages, Henry VIII shaped the future of England, yet his personal choices came with a heavy price. His divorces, executions, and constant quest for a male heir redefined the monarchy and set the stage for one of the most transformative eras in English history. But what lessons can we learn from his royal disasters? How do his actions teach us about the consequences of ambition and the dangers of unchecked power? As we reflect on Henry's legacy, we see not just a tyrant, but a man whose choices affected generations to come. This was a king who sought to control everything, from his kingdom to his wives. But in his pursuit of control, he lost much more than he gained. The price of his marriages was not just the lives of his wives, but the very structure of the monarchy itself. Henry's choices changed the course of history, but was the cost too high? By the end of this video, you'll have uncovered the deep, often tragic truths behind Henry VIII's 6 marriages. What may have seemed like a simple story of love and succession is actually filled with power struggles, betrayal, and royal ambition. You'll understand the high cost of ambition and how these marriages shaped not just Henry's life, but the entire course of England's history. You will now see Henry VIII as more than just a tyrant. He was a man whose actions and choices set the stage for one of the most transformative eras in history. The 6 wives of Henry VIII are often seen as the backdrop of his reign, but there's much more beneath the surface. Most people think it was all about love, but in reality it was far more complex. These marriages were driven by ambition, survival, and an unyielding desire for control. At first glance, you may think Henry was just a man obsessed with securing a male heir for his throne. And yes, the pressure to have a son played a pivotal role in his decisions, but there's more. His marriages weren't just about producing heirs. They were about alliances, politics, and ultimately power. And while we're familiar with the historical narrative, we haven't fully explored the true motivations behind his choices. What was the real cost of these 6 marriages? What do they tell us about power, legacy, and the pursuit of control? By the end of this video, you'll discover the often overlooked truths about Henry VIII's reign. You'll see how his marriages shaped not just his life, but the future of England, and why each one of these marriages came at a heavy cost. Henry's search for a male heir was no simple matter. He was determined to secure a future for his dynasty and restore the power of the monarchy, but his obsession with having a son set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter England's course. Was it really just about securing an heir, or was there something more driving his decisions? It all began with Katherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. Catherine, a Spanish princess, was initially a political match, but their marriage quickly evolved into a deeply personal matter for Henry. The pressure for a male heir was relentless, and when Catherine failed to provide him with one, Henry's frustration grew. His desire to marry Anne Boleyn was not just about love, it was about survival, and a desire to break free from the shackles of Catholicism, which had previously condemned his marriage to Catherine. Yet Catherine was no passive figure in this drama. She fought for her position with dignity, refusing to accept divorce, and forcing Henry to confront the personal consequences of his decisions. Anne Boleyn entered the picture with her own ambitions, capturing Henry's heart and the political landscape of England. Anne promised Henry not just a male heir, but a new future for England, a future without the constraints of the Pope's power. But as history unfolded, Anne failed to deliver the desired son, giving birth to Elizabeth instead. Her story is far more tragic than you might think. Then there was Jane Seymour, the woman who gave Henry his long-desired male heir, Edward Zist. But this victory was short-lived. Jane died just days after childbirth, making her the only wife Henry didn't divorce. So, was Jane Seymour the true love of Henry's life, or was she just the solution to his succession problem? The pain Henry felt after her death was profound, yet his grief would not prevent him from seeking his next bride. Anne of Cleves, Henry's 4th wife, enters the scene as a political match, but their marriage was doomed from the start. Henry's disappointment upon meeting Anne is well documented, and their marriage was annulled within months. Was Anne's appearance the sole reason for this annulment, or was there more to the story? What role did politics play in this ill-fated marriage, and how much did personal preference factor into Henry's decisions? Then came Catherine Howard, the young and beautiful cousin of Anne Boleyn. Catherine's marriage to Henry was filled with promise, but soon her infidelity would lead to her downfall. Was Catherine truly truly guilty of the charges brought against her, or was she simply a victim of her time and the pressure of Henry's court? Catherine Howard's tragic end shows us the dangers of living under the ever-watchful eye of a monarch who was known for his quick temper and volatile emotions. Finally, Catherine Parr, the widow who survived them all. Catherine's ability to navigate the dangers of Henry's court speaks to her intelligence and diplomacy. She managed to outlive Henry, not only by taking care of him during his declining years, but by mastering the delicate art of survival. Was Catherine Parr merely lucky, or was she a shrewd survivor who played the court politics to her advantage? As we explore these 6 marriages, it becomes clear that Henry VIII's decisions weren't just about love or succession. His marriages were deeply entangled with political and religious shifts that would change the course of history. From Katherine of Aragon to Catherine Parr, each wife had a unique impact on England's political landscape. But what about Henry himself? His marriages weren't just the result of his desire for a male heir. They were a reflection of his need for control, his willingness to shape the destiny of his kingdom, and his deep-seated fear of failure. Henry VIII's reign was marked by a ruthless desire to assert his authority, and the consequences of this were far-reaching. Each marriage revealed a different side of Henry, from his youthful optimism in marrying Katherine of Aragon, to his explosive passions with Anne Boleyn, to his ultimate disillusionment with the court system. Henry's marriages tell us about more than just the men and women involved. They reveal a king who was struggling to shape his own legacy. But what was the true cost of these marriages? The personal suffering of his wives, the religious upheaval in England, and the political alliances formed and broken all had long-lasting consequences. By the time Henry's reign ended, his legacy had been irrevocably altered, and the monarchy was never the same. In the end, Henry VIII's 6 marriages were more than just a royal soap opera. They were a reflection of the power struggles, the political ambition, and the personal desires that shaped Tudor England. Tragic and dramatic consequences of his actions echo through history. By the end of this video, you'll have uncovered the deep, often tragic truths behind Henry VIII's marriages, and you'll understand why each marriage left its mark on the kingdom. What may have seemed like a simple story of love and succession is actually filled with power struggles, betrayal, and royal ambition. Henry's choices shaped the future of England in ways that are still felt today. You'll now see Henry VIII as more than just a tyrant. He was a man whose actions set the stage for one of the most transformative eras in history. So, as we reflect on his marriages, what can we learn from the man who thought he could control everything? His story teaches us about the high cost of ambition, the dangerous effects of unchecked power, and the deep human struggles that drive history forward. The question remains, was it worth it? And more importantly, what lessons can we take away from the lives of the 6 women who were caught in his orbit? As we uncover these stories, we understand that the true cost of Henry's 6 marriages was not just political power or royal alliances, it was the very fabric of the monarchy itself. The price he paid was high, but the lessons learned from his actions will resonate for generations. If you enjoyed this epic journey, please subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical tales. Don't miss out on new videos. Hit the notification bell to stay updated.